The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Our saint today that we're going to begin with is very well known to many of us, Saint Damien de Veuster, or commonly known as Saint Damien to the island of Molokai. We know him as the patron saint of lepers. He ministered to them. He was from Belgium, and he died from Hansen's disease at the age of 49. Let's talk a little bit about what perhaps was going on in his life and times as he goes to Molokai, this kind of remote island as one of the many islands in Hawaii.
Well, we might tend to think of Hawaii as a great destination spot, but certainly where he was traveling to was not seen in that way whatsoever. And Damien really would have looked back to the time of Jesus for this call. I think we're all familiar with more than one story in Scripture when Jesus is there to minister to the leper. There's the one leper, then we have the 10 who are cleansed, and the one comes back and thanks him. But what's always very interesting in those healings of the leper is when Jesus says, "Go and show yourself to the priest, and that will be proof of your healing." That was very important because that was the only way they could be judged clean and re-enter the community. You know, we hear about the lepers. They're on the outskirts of town. They're dwelling among caves. You are, it's become the common term, a leper, which means you are removed from the community. And so by the time of Damien, there's an entire island where these people are removed to.
It's interesting because it was at the age of 24 that Father Damien, as a young priest, as a newly ordained priest, decides to enter into this missionary effort on the island of Molokai, going to what some would have considered a native country, very pagan country, polytheistic. We think of it as an island paradise, but it was a kingdom paradise. Mm-hmm. And so going to Molokai, which was a complete island that was set totally on its own, basically survival of the fittest was there. These people contracted this terrible disease that probably was given to them because of the merchants and the shippers that came from other parts of the world. They contracted this terrible disease, and not knowing what to do, they were completely isolated. And of course, as you had said, going back to Jesus' time where they were removed totally from society. And there's this whole sense of isolation. And going as a newly ordained, going with hopefully all this joy and fervor into this very desolate area where it's kind of like anarchy there, to begin what was a legacy of starting schools, beginning an orphanage, teaching people how to take care of themselves in the midst of this dreaded disease where their body was basically atrophying and falling apart. And how he himself then contracted leprosy. I have a wonderful story that I'd like to share, if you don't mind. The English artist Edward Clifford decided to go to Molokai to paint a portrait of Father Damien. And before he went there, he was unaware that Father Damien actually contracted the disease of leprosy. But Clifford had traveled a long way to paint the portrait. When he got there, he discovered that Damien's face was pretty well ravaged by the disease. And yet he came the distance. He decided to paint the portrait, which he did. He brought it back to his studio, which he put in the window of his studio, which was on a busy thoroughfare in the city of London. Soon complaints came in. People saw this terrible, tragic, ugly, hideous face, and they complained. They said, "Get rid of this painting. It's just disgusting for us to look at." Well, when word got around that it was actually a portrait of Father Damien, then things changed. There was a total transformation or transfiguration that happened. Bids came in to buy the portrait. People lined up for blocks just to see it. So there's that whole sense that they looked beneath this ugly, ravaged face and saw something that was underneath, which was the face of sacrificial love. And so that is what is really the life and the legacy of Damien of Molokai, is this whole life in mission and ministry of love and service to the poor, to the downtrodden, to the lepers, to the outcast, to the lonely, to the despairing. And how we can understand that in our own life as we minister to people.
Absolutely, and I think what's so interesting is, as you said, at age 24, recently ordained, and how many perhaps are more concerned about how they're going to celebrate Mass, or how they're going to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation, or are they going to do marriage prep accurately, and maybe to get caught up in a little of the trappings, coming from Belgium. But surrendering is life, and you have to imagine the incredible desire to truly connect with Christ. And when you were speaking of the painting, I couldn't help but think, that painting could also been entitled "The Face of Christ," who takes on our nature. He takes on our sin. He takes on whatever is grabbing hold of us. And so very much for the leper, he takes that on. And so Damien becomes that face of Christ. And think how those people were so shocked when they first saw it. But even ravaged, think of what that face meant to other lepers when he was still ministering to them. That they were to see a face that was physically ravaged, but to see the compassion and the love and the mercy that radiated from that face.
Now, we have about 2 minutes left of our first segment. He was canonized in 2009 by Pope Emeritus Benedict, and his feast is May 10th on the mainland in the United States, the lower 48. But in Hawaii, they celebrate his feast on April 15th, which was the actual day of his death. His hand is actually buried on the island of Molokai. I know that there's a shrine there and a church there for him. And very briefly, let's mention about his presence in the U.S. Capitol.
Well, there is a statue of St. Damien that resides in the Capitol. And currently, each state has 2 statues of whoever they choose to be in the Capitol. And for Hawaii, he is one of those 2 statues. So when you think of 100 people whose images in a certain area of the Capitol provide an example of what it is to truly be a citizen of this land. And I think that's what we have to say. There's nothing political about it. He truly became a citizen, which at heart is to be a good and faithful and loving member of the community and to promote the common good. And so in this region of our current country that was not a state, or anything at that point, but he symbolizes the best of that land.
And we're going to talk about another saint to the island of Molokai in just a moment. We'll be right back.
Light Moments. Here's Father Tom McSweeney.
Sarah Pollock's mother and father promised her a car if she graduated from high school with good grades and a college scholarship. And when she achieved both these distinctions, they gave her $15,000. But Sarah didn't use the money to buy a car. Instead, she started a college fund for needy students. Sarah had heard some of her classmates talk about the struggle their families had just trying to make ends meet, and it upset her to learn that these students wouldn't have the chance to go to college. So Sarah started the fund with the money that her parents had given her. Giving others an opportunity to develop their talent was more important to her than owning a car. Sarah Pollock, wise beyond her years, reminds us that people are more important than possessions. She graduated with an A in living the golden rule.
This message from the Christophers, New York, 10017. It's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness.
Welcome back to our show. The saint that Father Lavelle and I will talk about now is Saint Marianne Cope. She obviously was a contemporary of Saint Damien of Molokai, but her beginnings really were as a German-born American in Syracuse, New York. She founded some hospitals. She worked with girls, with the poor, also with lepers. Let's talk a little bit about the beginnings of her life and her ministry.
Well, first, I think it's probably still interesting to many of our viewers when they hear Syracuse, New York. We still might have this concept that saints are people from other time periods and other lands. And I think it's worth noting as we do this series that everyone has the potential to be a saint, and that there are saints of our time, and there are saints certainly of our land. There's currently 50-some that have a connection to the United States that are from the very beginnings up to the beatification process. Marianne Cope is one of those examples. German by nationality, but an American citizen, and born about 20 years before the Civil War begins, lives up to the end of World War I. So again, as we mentioned with some of the others, a very interesting time period in our country to see how different groups of people are being treated. So I think that might also be a hallmark. You know, she grew up knowing and hearing about slavery in the South, but residing in New York. She would have known what was happening as westward movement and the presence of Native Americans. And so she knows these stories of people who are judged by their race, the God they worship, the color of their skin. And so it's very interesting that she herself in her ministry chooses another segment of the population that is mistreated and neglected simply because of what is going on with them physically.
It's interesting because when we talked about St. Damien going to the island of Molokai as a newly ordained priest, we have this woman, this religious woman, who understands what she's going to. So there's this whole sense of she knows what it's all about. And she goes really and helps. Damien is really his right hand in this ministry side by side. They work with the lepers. Now she, of course, did not contract the disease of leprosy. And sometimes that's the myth with Hansen's disease, that anyone that comes in contact with a leper automatically becomes a leper. That's not the case. But there's this high probability that it could happen. But this selflessness that is part of her life. Even after her ministry in Syracuse, founding hospitals and doing work with the poor and the sick and the needy, she decides to really take on a whole new life and a whole ministry. And she dies at the age of 80 in Molokai. And so there's a sense that her life has really found its fulfillment among the lepers on this, what began as a desolate island now turns into somewhat of a paradise and a place of consolation and hope and joy for those that are sent there.
Absolutely. And I think, as you mentioned, she knew what she was getting into. And so she was prepared for the work. I don't know that she could, or anyone could fully have been prepared for what she experienced, physically being there and seeing how this ravages one's body. But she was prepared, I would say, from the foundations of her life. She was prepared to be compassionate, to be loving, to be merciful, and really the hallmark of many of our fine religious sisters, to roll up her sleeves and do whatever is needed. That image of the old nun, in the full habit, who's rolling up the sleeves and has the apron on and, is going to do whatever is needed. She was willing to do whatever Damien needed.
It's interesting because we've got about 4 minutes left of our second segment. That she, in her beatification and canonization, is very significant in the pontificate of Benedict XVI. We know that she is the first to be beatified by him in his pontificate, and she's the last to be canonized by him in his pontificate. And how odd that whole thing is. And we as Christians don't necessarily believe in coincidence. We believe that there's a reason for all of this. And so there's this whole sense that in this short pontificate of Emeritus Benedict, that this life of this great woman, this saint, is found blessed, venerable, blessed, and then sainthood. And how in a short span of time, her whole life is drawn together.
Absolutely. And certainly we don't believe in coincidence. We cannot say that this was purposely set out by the Holy Father. His announcement of his retirement took everyone by surprise. And so the process of canonization in place, when all of these were happening. But I say that we could look at the divine guidance of the Holy Spirit when you talk about, and there could have been any other saint. That might have been the bookends, if you will, of the pontificate when it came to beatification and canonization. But we're looking at a woman, now of course, the connection of being German, so to Joseph Ratzinger, we might say, well, isn't that a beautiful tribute to his homeland, one of his own. But I think also what cannot be lost is that sense of service and that sense of being willing to be at the disposal of someone else. And I think as we, not to move too far away from Marianne Cope, as we continue to look at the pontificate of Benedict XVI, we could draw parallels to one who was always willing to roll up his sleeves and do whatever John Paul asked him to do, and who really saw his papacy as a continuation of that legacy. Very much Marianne's work, to continue the beautiful legacy of Damien and to recognize that call to service and to do what she could. We see that in Benedict, to really be of service. And even to the point, many have said, even in his retirement, he was serving the Church's best interest. And I think that's a beautiful gift that both Marianne and Benedict share.
Well, her feast is celebrated on January 23rd, and the wonderful thing about her life in ministry, it's really celebrated by two places. Obviously, Syracuse, New York, where she finds her beginnings as a sister, as a religious woman, working with the poor in hospital care, and then in the state of Hawaii, where she sees her ministry continued and eventually ended among those who need her most in her life. And so we see that whole cycle. And in our lives are the same thing. We're called in different phases and points in our life to take on new challenges, new things to give God glory and give God honor. We're going to take a break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
Instead of sitting on the couch, I hope to clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say, thinking of her. And the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together?
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to Communion of Saints. We leave the island of Molokai with Saint Damien and Saint Marianne Cope, and we go to the country of Italy, primarily in Perugia, to this very, very contemporary saint who's with us today that many people pray for intercession. Her name is St. Rita of Cascia. She is really the flip side of St. Jude, who we pray for impossible causes. People pray to St. Rita in the exact same way. Let's talk about what might have been going on in her life, in her young life.
Well, it's worth noting she was born in the late 1300s. She was a married woman. Her husband was murdered. And so it's very interesting when you think of what a woman's life would be like, even in Italy, in the late or early 1400s by this time, without a husband, to be a widow. You're kind of left to the winds. And so what happens with many widows of that time, or who are deep in their faith, is they seek a life in the church. And her life then invites this fulfillment, to truly be a servant of the Lord.
What's interesting is you had mentioned that she was a widow, but she also had children who also died.
Yes.
So she's left kind of like all alone. So there's this whole sense that her life has become one of desolation. And so she enters a religious life, which was probably not unknown back then. However, there were some religious communities that did not accept her primarily because she was a widow and was married previously. But a community did accept her. She has done some wonderful things within her community, but her claim to fame really is her piety, her devotion. Legend says, it's really not legend, but those who knew her saw marks on her forehead, almost like the stigmata in the hands of Padre Pio with the crown of thorns. And so her devotion to Christ and his suffering on the cross. And isn't that really the call not only of the saints, but of all who follow Christ, that whole call to follow him, to pick up their cross daily, to walk in his way?
Absolutely. And I think as we go back then to being widowed, to experience the death of her children, and we make that connection to impossible causes, think how impossible her life must have seemed. And yet she perseveres in faith. How many of us today would lose our faith over far more trivial occurrences in our life because we might think God has abandoned us, or God doesn't care about me, or God, cares about this group and he's turned his back on me. But Rita did not do that. She not only didn't do that, she again turned to the church to offer herself. And so that crown of thorns, I think, is so symbolic of the life that was put upon her. That journey of Calvary that she had already experienced. To lose a husband and lose your children, what greater pain can there be? And so she bore very much this journey of Calvary already. And yet, like Christ, she bore it with a dignity and a reverence and an abiding faith in God.
The interesting thing, as an aside to all this, is that St. Rita of Cascia is really the unofficial patron saint of baseball. It goes back to the 2002 movie The Rookie, starring Dennis Quaid, where and it's based on a true story actually too. The group of religious women known as the Sisters of Santa Rita had actually purchased an oil well. Well, the oil well unfortunately went sour. And so they prayed to St. Rita for intercession to somehow bring back this oil well, because they relied on it for their community and their livestock, their life itself. And so they took rose petals and threw them over the oil well, praying to St. Rita. And this was shown in the movie. And the people who worked the oil fields at the time tried to help the sisters along with this. And it took some time for them to actually get the well going again, which eventually proved to be very strong and life-giving in oil. But in the meantime, to kind of waylay their time, they played baseball. And so playing baseball during this time of praying to St. Rita that the oil well would come back, some of these men actually became National League baseball players. And so they became rookies, actually. And so there's that whole sense that she is their patron saint, probably not even just unofficially, but because of this. And so this whole sense of intercession among the saints, and how important is that for us nowadays as Catholics to pray to the saints to intercede for us?
Well, I think it's perhaps needed now more than ever. To invite these lives and these examples. And one thing that is noted is, we spoke earlier in a segment about John Paul canonizing and beatifying so many people and saying it was because of the need for their example. It is worth noting that we do not canonize saints for themselves. The Church's labeling them a saint or blessed doesn't make them any holier, any more devout, or any more special because of that than they were during their life here on earth. Their relationship with God allowed them to have the life they had and brings them to their place in heaven. It's for us. They are canonized so that we have examples, we have stories, we can unite with the different aspects of their lives. So much so that you can have an Italian saint who inspires and sustains the life of not only a religious community, but also the men who are assisting that community. And in the meantime, to progress in their baseball careers. But we're exposed to their lives.
It's interesting, she was canonized some 200 years after her death in 1626, but beatified, but she wasn't canonized until 1900 by Pope Leo XIII. So there's this tremendous span of time that's there. But as I had mentioned in the beginning, there's this renewed energy to pray to her because she is, like St. Jude, the patron of lost causes and impossible causes. And how many times in our life we look at our lot and we say how impossible life is and how terrible it is. And we have a saint, not only in St. Jude, but also in St. Rita, that we could pray to intercede for us, to help us work through this defunct oil well that is our lives, to make it gush again with new life in the Lord. And we do that primarily through the Lord, through Jesus, but also through the saints. And so we pray to her for all of the needs that we have this day. And we thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.